Welcome to the Modern Hippie podcast, where we'll be exploring all of my favorite boundary-pushing people and topics surrounding consciousness, psychedelics, mental performance, functional medicine, living in alignment, and so much more. I'm your host, Barrett Perlman, a former pro wakeboarder turned body worker, energy healer, and well, a modern hippie. And I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back to the Modern Hippie podcast. I am joined today by Dr. John Churchill, who is a teacher of the Buddhist fourth turning Planetary Dharma, author of Becoming Buddha, a Buddhist contemplative psychologist, and co-founder of Karuna Mandala. Thank you so much for joining me today, John.
Thank you, Barrett.
Oh man, I am so excited to have you as a guest today. I discovered you on the Aubrey Marcus podcast, who is like, his podcast is just full of gold, and you were one of them. And I heard your interview with him and I was so mind blown. I was like, I don't even think most people I know are even ready to hear what you're talking about. So you practice basically Buddhist contemplative psychology. And what is that?
What is Buddhist psychology? Well, Buddhism as a mind science is as comprehensive as Western psychology. So if you think of all the different kinds of Western psychologies that we have, that's also true of Buddhist psychology. But generally, Western psychology focuses on the processes of growth from infanthood to adulthood. And Buddhist psychology focuses on from adulthood to Buddhahood. So what are the stages? You've gone through significant stages of growth from when you were wearing a diaper, as have I. And those we've gone through significant developmental stages that you can look back and you can say, wow, those I was really in a different stage of development. And the thing that happens in our culture, we become an adult and then we feel like that's completed. But really, from the perspective of the Buddhist tradition, you're probably maybe a third of the way, or maybe, halfway on a path of full adult development. So, Buddhist psychology is looking at what are the far potentials of human growth. And Buddhahood is the term that they give for the actualization of full human potential.
And is that the state of like living in Nirvana? Is that the state of like full awakening and awareness?
Well, I mean, Nirvana is a term that means extinction, right? So what Nirvana means is that all negative states have been extinguished. So from a Western point of view, Nirvana is like the full extinguishing of all effects of multi-generational trauma, right? So that's what Nirvana is. Shh, guys, excuse me. and then so there's that dimension, which is about like the ending of suffering, and then you have another dimension which has got to do with the flourishing of all positive qualities or all positive capacities. So all positive, the development of all the positive states of mind, and then also the development of the kind of awareness that can maintain its consciousness through waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. And then also the development of all kinds of siddhis, all kinds of powers. So, a full process of cleaning up the past, like maturing and flourishing as a self, and then the development of kind of future potentials.
How interesting. Well, I've been reading your book, which I have right here, Becoming Buddha.
That's
and yeah, it's a good read.
Yeah.
Anything to help me start getting these concepts through my head, because I have signed up for your year-long program that starts in January, which is the only way to work with you next year. So that was how I really got pulled into that. And so interesting that, nirvana is the extinguishment of all things suffering and negative and those cycles. And then there's state after that is pleasure, embracing the
Yes,
pleasure,
yes.
seeking the
Well,
pleasure.
yeah, yeah. So there's dukkha. Have you heard the term dukkha? Suffering. And then there's sukha. Sukha means
Yeah.
so the in Buddhist psychology they often talk about the term dukkha or suffering, and what dukkha literally means is it's a Sanskrit word that means what happens when a wheel um, gets spun in mud and doesn't go anywhere.
Mm,
So we all know what it's
mm,
like to have our wheels spinning and not go anywhere. So
totally.
that's what their definition of suffering is, and the definition, the opposite of that, is sukha, which is actually the term for bliss, which is that actually
Mm,
understanding that our bodies and our nervous systems are wired for positive states, and that actually our intrinsic nature is good. It's just that it's covered up by the inheritance of multi generational trauma, and that when that's purified,
mm,
what's left behind is the inherent goodness of being a human being.
mm. I like that because I feel like that's almost, and I'm sure that the cycle of cognitive origination would kind of argue with this a little bit, but children tend to be born with that sense of goodness before it gets all messed up. I know there's the trauma of coming into this world, but that's like the closest you could say that we start to it and then have to get rid of everything that we experience to get back there.
To get back there,
Is that
right?
interesting?
Yeah.
How did you get into Buddhism?
Well, um, I started pretty young. I was, I yeah, I mean, going way back, I think I used to like astral project out of my body when I was like 4 or 5 years old, and kind of fly around the house as a kid. And
Mm,
so I was kind of aware that reality was there was more to reality than what everybody said that there was. Um, and
mhm,
so I think, starting like 12, 13, I grew up in a family where these things were kind of on the table. I had a grandmother who was really into Zen meditation and Jungian dream work. So I started getting coached in dream work when I was like 12. And we had used to have a
wow.
yoga teacher come to the class, to come to our house and so I began to learn about meditation and yoga 12, 13 years old. And by the time I was like 15, like that was like, I was just really fascinated with, well, it became pretty evident to me that there had to be more to human evolution than what I was seeing around me. Right. So that's kind of, so I started off pretty young, and I studied both kind of Western traditions. I was interested in kind of uh, Jewish Kabbalah and Western ritual magic, and Sufi practices and alchemy and those kinds of things. But I mean, as I matured in later adolescence, and it was time to like, well, where are the great masters still alive? Where am I going to find people that I can really go and study with? I mean, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition probably has like still some of the the most potent initiatory systems on the planet that are still functioning. So
Mm,
you know, I'm not really. I would say that I'm a Buddhist. I'm more of a Gnostic in the sense that I'm interested in all the world's wisdom traditions. It's just that I've had
mm,
particular training within the Indo-Tibetan one, but I'm interested in all wisdom, right? All wisdom and understanding of what it means to be a human being. Yeah, I spent some
mm.
time as a monk when I was like 20, 21, and I came to the States to study at the Naropa Institute, which is like a Buddhist university here in Colorado. Um, yeah, so it's been the main focus of my life now for about more than 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love that you're just a seeker of wisdom. I feel like that's the the best way to live out in the world is constantly seeking to gain the knowledge of that which you don't know. And because there's so much, and each sector and facet of the world has its own wonderful knowledge to share with us. Gosh, what a blessing to have had a household that encouraged that. I mean,
Hmm.
I was growing up and my grandparents almost disowned me for trying to check out a book about paganism from the library.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, I
yeah. I
think
was
back
blessed
to
in
like
that.
that was in, you were what?
I was blessed in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, gosh, lucky. Um, wow. And so you've been spending these last, what'd you say, several decades dedicated to Buddhism. And are you still astrally projecting all over the place? How has that changed how you show up in the unified field?
No, yeah, I think I've left those days behind. um, yeah, yeah. I mean, Buddhist. I mean, there is a certain amount of those practices within the Buddhist tradition, but the focus is much more on kind of like becoming the unified field rather than flying through it.
Mm.
You know, it's like rather than getting in a little rowboat and rowing across the ocean, it's that the focus is really on becoming the ocean. So
Mm.
that's all my it's a different level of study, right?
Right.
Like, what does human potential look like when we are able to shift our basis of identity from being located within a body, located within a self, located within time and space, located within duality. Like, what happens as we shift our basis of operation? So it's really about shifting, learning to shift one's identity, right? So that we are kind of able
Mm.
to function as many different levels of identity simultaneously. So simultaneously being a human and simultaneously being the unified field, right? Both of them at the same time.
Mm. Yeah, which is having experienced that here and there myself is pure magic. I took your 1 day workshop on metacognitive awareness, and
Hmm.
that was fucking great. Um,
Oh, cool.
you really tied together a lot of tied together a lot of concepts that I thought I was only going to be able to tap into through plant medicines. And I remember I said to you something about that, and I was like, you're bridging this gap for me between plant medicines and having that existence every day. And you said something to me that's really just stuck as the most empirical wisdom that I received that day, which was that just me having that thought and that belief that it didn't extend outside the plant medicine was my own self-limiting belief. And I was like,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
dropping wisdom bombs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the plant wisdom, the plant medicine, how did you reflect now, and how did that affect your, like, there was something in the meditation where you're like, oh, this is similar. What was it that was similar?
Mm. Um, so, metacognitive awareness, as you were teaching us, is basically finding the boundary, not finding, but searching for the boundaries in all of our
Hmm.
senses and essentially not finding them because they don't exist. And
Right.
as you search beyond the awareness of your body and try to find the boundary where your skin stops and the space around your skin begins, it just gets so infinitesimally small that you discover that there is no boundary. And so as you relax, for me specifically, into to that sensation, you begin to feel pure connectedness to the unified field, and that pure dissolution that I think is associated with the ego dissolution on plant medicines.
Hmm.
And as the ego dissolves, it's not that you disappear, because obviously the second you identify that you're dissolving, your ego is still fully present. But you become more, you become everything, you become connected to it all. And that was what was very reminiscent for me of plant medicines, was like that first step past the DMT breakthrough, where the harder I would surrender and release and relax, the more I would dissolve and dissipate. And I started to feel that through what you were teaching us with metacognitive awareness.
Mhm. Right, right. Yeah. So the question around plant medicine versus meditation. Um,
Mm.
I mean, the thing about what the plant medicine does for many people, it gives them a potent enough experience. It raises the energy level in our experience enough that we can perceive that through the state that everything is interconnected, right? So it
Hmm.
raises the energy level up. It would be similar, like if you do really intense breath work, right? If you can raise the energy level up beyond a certain limit, then we get access to being able to, in that state, to know that things are interconnected. The difference from from a
Hmm.
meditative approach is that, um, well, first, I think it's important to know that those kinds of techniques were always a part of the mystery schools. So plant medicine work and breath work, those more ecstatic approaches, were always part of the
Hmm.
traditions. But in the long
Mm.
run, meaning after, decades after decades after decades of practice, you don't want to be continually drinking the juice 30 years from now in order to, right? So
Yeah.
in order to develop the trait capacity, right? So the difference between state and trait is that a trait capacity means that that's how your mind is functioning, right? So for trait
Mm.
capacity, it means you actually have to train your cognition. And by cognition here, I don't mean thinking, I mean your perspective taking. The mind has
Mm.
to train to see through or to understand the nature of our experience in a deeper way. And when you do that, when
Hmm.
you train the mind that way, those states that are usually accessible through medicines become permanent traits, right? And so then it becomes
Yeah.
like a uh, developmental acquisition. It doesn't go away. So
Hmm.
and I
Oh,
don't know. I don't know. I honestly just don't know if medicine work does that. The only way I would think it
really?
does, yeah. Well, over decades, I haven't had enough discussions with shamans to know if that's the case or not. I don't know. Yeah.
Hmm. Oh, I would love to introduce you to one. If you're not familiar with Hamilton Souther, he's been doing um, ayahuasca shamanism for 20 years. Kind of the first Westerner to become a shaman, and he's recently become my mentor. And
Hmm.
the
Oh, I'd
the
love
way
to have
that
to
he
talk with
sits and exists, yeah, he sits and exists as a different kind of person, and his connection and the way that he can not manipulates, I mean, manipulate is the correct word, but it carries somewhat negative connotations with it, but affect change in the source code just is it's profound and powerful to,
Oh, that's
you know,
wonderful to hear.
what he wills comes to fruition.
Mm, mm,
Yeah.
mm, mm.
So how did you use plant medicine on your journey?
Well, it was more part of my journey when I was younger, because the kind of
Mm.
training, at least the traditional training that I had, is it's kind of normal states, and then learning to develop your own altered states rather than using plants. But as a kid, I had worked with, of course, cannabis and mushrooms and
Mm.
LSD, DMT. So I've always been really curious. It's just the journey of the last 30 years took me more up into the mountains, if you will, and and not down into the jungles.
They either prefer one or the other, the mountains, the jungles, or.
Yeah, I don't think I prefer one or the other. Actually, I think if it had been included as part of my like apprenticeship and studies, I would have been like, absolutely. But at least while you're getting, at least while you're training, it's good to master one system. It's good to like really have a good handle on one system first. At least that was my,
Mm.
you know. Now I'm looking forward to learning much more about plant medicine.
Oh, fantastic. Ugh, I love to be joining you on your journey at this time. That is my favorite. And so, what is metacognitive awareness for my listeners who don't know?
Um, well, I mean, let's okay. A basic model of human experience. We have our attentional system, right? So our attentional
Hmm.
system right now is what's listening and attending to each other, and to the listeners who are listening right now, their attentional system is that part of their mind that is able to follow and attend and to separate um, out information out from the field, right? And the attentional
Hmm.
system is at the very center of the ego structure. So the ego structure is maintained by the attention. In fact, you can think of the attention, it's the fusion with the attention, which is what the source of the sense of being separate from the wider field, right? That wider field, if we're
Mm.
constantly pulled into to an attention, then we're not able to experience, or we're not as aware as we could be of that wider field. Now, awareness, on the other hand, is global, right? So the difference between attention and awareness is that right now, as we're looking at each other, our attention can see each other's faces on the screen, but our awareness can look at the whole room, right? And so awareness is
Mm.
always like 360, right? It's always on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're functioning that way, right? So most people actually are functioning inside of their
Mm.
attentional system the whole time, and they never are taking in the whole field. I mean, and that's one of the things that happens with
Yeah.
plant medicine is you get flooded with information, which basically pops the attentional system, and all of that information is flowing through, and it kind of opens up the aperture of the ego, right? You can think of the attentional
Mm.
system as the ego aperture, and for most people, it's a pretty small sphincter, right? Now, metacognitive
Yes.
awareness. What's metacognitive awareness is, basically, well, on a simple level, it's basically being able to take perspective on your experience. So, I mean, if you're able to witness your own experience and know that you're witnessing your experience, that's a certain kind of metacognitive awareness. But
Hmm.
in the um, in the Buddhist tradition, they've really refined what we would call insight meditation. And insight meditation is really about metacognition. So it would be about
Mm.
examining with your intelligence the conventional structures that appear to format experience. So, for instance, I think one of the things we were exploring that weekend is like dualistic perception, for instance, right? Like,
Hmm.
we tend to believe that there's a world out there that we're seeing, and that we're inside behind our eyeballs looking at the world, right? And of course, when we
Mm.
poke our eye, it feels like that. But actually, if you examine with your intelligence, so metacognitive awareness is usually a search into the nature of how you are constructing experience. So if we were to search right now to see if we could find, like, where does this outside world end, and then where does your awareness begin, right? Is like awareness just behind the eyeball, right? Well, if you actually take time and you are exploring the boundary, you begin. to realize that there isn't a boundary in direct experience, right? And that actually
Mm-hmm.
kind of neuroscientists, cognitive scientists understand that we experience the world much more like we experience a dream, and that actually what the world that you're experiencing right now that appears to be outside is actually being completely generated within awareness, right? Completely generated within
Mm.
mind. So there's no outside, there's no inside, right? So that kind of
Literally.
insight, right? If you literally do that as a practice, after a while, it literally wires that capacity in, right? That's literally how your perception is, and that would be the same thing for the body, right? Like um, we tend to believe that our body has boundaries because we see that the body has boundaries, and then we project that onto our experience in every moment, like, oh, I'm in a body and my body has boundaries, right? But if you
Mm.
take the time and the mind is quietened and you go inside and you begin to explore, where are the boundaries of the body and how deep is the body? And as you begin to look, which is what this metacognitive capacity is, you begin to experience, well, actually, my awareness appears to extend beyond the boundaries of the body. Right. So that kind of metacognitive process is involved in all development. So if you think of an infant, like an infant, they're completely fused with their experience. They're fused with their body, they're fused with their emotions. They're so fused with their body that they can't control their body. And so, as they
Mm.
develop a metacognitive capacity to see the body as an object, then we gain control of the body, and now you can move your body. And then the same thing happens
Mm-hmm.
emotionally. Like when you're 4, 5 years old, 3, 4, 5, your emotions are all over the place. And as you begin to get some distance, you can begin to see that you're not the emotions, so to speak, right? And that you begin to get some distance on it. And that's the same thing with
Mm.
our thought processes. Is that, when we first begin to use our minds, we're really fused with thought. And then as we go through adolescence, we learn metacognitively that you can think about different ways of thinking. So not only do you have a primary way of thinking, you learn that you can think about, how do I want to think like this or do I want to think like that? Right. So you
Mm-hmm.
can see that there's a process here. And then you get to a certain point where actually the next step is, well, you go beyond the structure itself and now you have pure awareness, right? And now, what
Mm.
are the structures that are left that might be structuring pure awareness? Well, there might be the sense that you're in a body. So you actually can search into the body, realize that you're not fused with the body, and then the awareness becomes a little bigger. And then that same process happens with time and space. If you investigate the nature of time and space, same thing happens. Oh,
Mm.
time and space structures, awareness can then get, even bigger. Each one of those moves is kind of facilitated by a metacognitive capacity. Okay.
Mm.
So metacognition is vital
Yeah.
for growth all the way up, right, from being an infant, and also it's a part of pathology. So if you take a pathology like a narcissistic injury, for instance, so in a narcissistic
Mm.
injury, somebody might have the metacognitive capacity to like self-organize their own emotional experience, but actually have no metacognition of their own inner state. They won't even be aware that there's anybody at home. Because
Wow.
if you're a kid, if you're a child, for instance, and your parents never ask you, Barrett, how are you feeling today? Barrett, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? if nobody actually asks those questions, our minds don't develop the capacity to ask those questions inside.
Hmm.
How am I feeling? What do I think? Right? So imagine, I mean, these are perspectives that you take. You probably do this naturally without even thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
But some people don't even have the capacity to do that because they never did that with their minds.
Yeah, it's interesting to think it would have been ingrained in people so early. I mean, I specifically can think that I run into that when dating, or used to run into that much more frequently when dating, and um, questions get asked. Well, why do you feel that way? Or now, as I work with clients to change their mindsets and to shift their perspectives, um, some of the questions that seem so basic to me to ask, like, oh, well, when did that shift for you? Or, and they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, is that what you're doing suiting you? As you seem to be telling me all these negative results you're having, is the way that you're locked into in your mental system, is that working for you? And they're like, it's just the way I am. And I'm like, okay, well, let's break down that system. Let's ask more questions. Let's dig deeper and unearth some more of those details. And so, do you have systems to help develop that for people?
Yeah, I
That
mean,
ability to go further inwards?
what you're describing is what you're doing with your clients is you're parenting them essentially, right? Because those are the questions that somebody, well, yeah, those are the questions that somebody should have asked us, all of
Yeah.
us. How do you feel right now? I don't know how I
Hmm.
feel right now. Yeah, the
Right? Literally basics.
literally, I mean, it's that sad. It's that sad is that some of us never, like, somebody never asked you how are you feeling. It's like, oh, I have feelings,
Mm,
and that
right.
that so um those kinds of exercises go all the way up, all the way up to full Buddhahood.
Mm,
Meaning, it's the same. If we were to think of like being a coach or being a therapist never ended. It's just the same process,
mm,
except that there are um, more and more stages of growth and development, and deeper levels of identity and of experiencing the world that can be opened up.
mm. Are you at full Buddhahood?
I don't know. No, I'm not for Buddha. No, no, I don't. The journey never ends.
Hmm.
Yeah, the journey never ends. I don't really. I don't. I have no idea. I'm a I'm a human being.
Well, someone from your class told me that you can personally transcend space and time. And I was like, oh, God, I got to get to know this Dr. John guy. Got to get to know him well. I too would love to teleport.
That's. I mean, well, these are. Yeah, this is true, but these capacities aren't as they're they're not they're less about acquisitions as they are about surrendering.
Mm,
Right? That's why it's such a difficult question, because the part of me that you're asking the question quite clearly isn't. Do you know what I mean? Right? Like it's right, and it would be disingenuous if this functioning was to say yes, because clearly it's not. This functioning is an ego structure, right?
mm,
So there's so that we're I think we're human beings. I mean, so much about the awakening process, um, in the deeper levels, is recognizing. You see that the ego. There were some significant phases in um, in the journey. One of the journeys is the journey of individuation, right? And that's to some extent that's a
mhm,
journey about cleaning up, about differentiating from being fused with our early childhood environment and our cultural environment, right? And that's kind of therapy does that, and some personal growth does that. Um, And if you do that work, you become a well-functioning, capable human being, right? And then you have
Hmm.
then you have like the initiatory process. So initiation, if you will, is a process of kind of deepening into soul, right? And I think soul
Mm.
here we could say being like that dimension of us that journeys through eternity, right? So that
Okay.
part of us that journeys from life to life, that is still an individual expression of the sacred.
Hmm.
Um, and then, so we have that process, and then there's a third process of identification. And so the identification process is really about kind of recognizing the kind of the fundamental ground of being that's beyond the personality and beyond the soul, right? And in that sense, there is no journey
Mm.
in eternity because there is no time. And
Oof.
those three different um those are three, like, that's personality, soul, and spirit, right? And those are three different
Hmm.
dimensions. And the real alchemy is once you've kind of individuated, and then there's an initiatory process, and then there's a process of identification, is like bringing all those three together, right? And like, what does it really mean
Yep.
to be a full human being, who's a who is a humble human, without the smell of nug champa, right? Like being
But I love
being
Nag Champa.
well, we all love nug champa, but you know what I mean? Like, in the sense of being, like, just being a human as we are, and at the same time being a soul, and at the same time being spirit.
Mm. Yeah, I can see how that's quite the journey to go on.
I think
For
we're on it.
me personally, yeah, you can't get off. um, but I recall growing up through, my parents put me in therapy when I was 8 years old. That was the first time I ever wanted to kill myself. And growing up then through therapy gave me a deep awareness of self because I had someone else asking me those questions in formative years. Um,
Right.
and then it was sort of through meditation that got me into that next like soul level, and plant medicines that got me to that spirit level, where
Mhm.
just recently having had that full expression of seeing other people's energy, like thought fields coming off of them, and feeling that finger on the pulse, devoid of separation between time and space, where I could see everything as it had happened in the past, as it was happening in the future. And I could immediately feel everything that I was to create in this specific lifetime, just sitting on the outside of this third dimensional reality. And it's almost like I just have to like reach out and grab it and expend the energy to bring it into this dimension now. Like it all already exists. And it's been some interesting lessons in surrender, and um, it was like really blowing my mind until I heard you start talking about metacognitive awareness. I thought it was something only attainable through plant medicines, um, and
Well,
that's
the visualizations, like, you can see this deity behind me, but I mean, those
mm,
are the visualizations are like templates that allow that process to happen.
mm,
So not only is there kind of a, a an awareness process, to the extent that we want to manifest what it is that we're trying to manifest, to the extent that we'll put it this way: how we see ourself and how we see the self and how the world is, that they're constructed at the same time. So you and I,
mm,
when we construct a sense of self, we also construct a world. Now, what that also means is, when you transform the sense of self, not just in terms of like shifting your level of awareness, well, that's the first thing, is you learn how to shift your level of awareness to becoming the unified field. Once you're the
Mm.
unified field, then from a creative process you can return, but you don't return as John or Barrett. You return as this other being, right? Which is, they call this creation stage, creativity stage. And because, to the
Mm.
extent that you can return as this other being, the world starts to change, because the world has been held in a certain shape because you've been holding yourself in a certain shape, right? So there's a
Mm-hmm.
whole, within this tradition, there's a whole, the the whole magical dimension, which is very similar to the kind of shamanic magical dimensions of the medicine traditions. It's quite similar. Using, the only
Mm-hmm.
difference being is that rather than using plant medicine, you're using meditative states, but very similar in terms of learning how to not manipulate but play with reality, and how to
Mm-hmm.
manifest. um, the emphasis in the kind of the Buddhist tradition is around like the kind of the manifestation, in terms of, for the sake of all beings, right? For the sake of
Mm.
building a culture of wisdom and compassion. So maybe it's a little bit um, different there, but depending upon like the shaman, if a shaman has a big heart, well, then that's what they're going to be. That's what they'll be manifesting, I would imagine.
Right. I almost feel like it's taken it, like, I feel like manifestation implies a bit of surrender to the idea of it happening, attached, with a higher emotion, but you have the specific thing that you desire to manifest, and then you surrender and you let go of it. Whereas I feel like there's like this stage after that, that creativity, creation stage that you're talking about, which implies that, or as though, as I understood it through plant medicine, it was like the the surrender and the lack of attachment to it got to dis- disappear. I got to be attached to the idea. I got to say exactly what I wanted, and maybe because I already was completely love and light at that point, and am still currently, like, it just was more like, okay, well, I'm gonna need this, and it's all because my path personally is all love and light, and creating for the betterment of helping people heal and helping the world heal. Everything I'm asking for either helps put me on that path to facilitate that, or brings about more of it for other people. And it just felt like I started to be able to ask for, to request everything. I was like, how about some more money in my bank account? And then, like, the exact
Mhm.
amount I requested showed up, and I was like, cool. How about they not charge me for my bags that are 10 pounds overweight? And, like, literally having people look at me and look down, and I'm like rewriting the programming in their mind to be like, not going to charge her. And having the guy who that carries off the bags looking at the woman checking me in, and it being like, it's in Spanish, so he's like, excessivo, which is like excess weight. And she's just sort of like
Yeah.
looking at it down and looking back at me as I'm like, you're not going to charge me. And finally she's like, no, no, you'll be fine, just here you go. Like,
Mhm.
it's interesting how many things like that I was able to create while I was really in that creationary attachment,
Mhm.
creationary field.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So in the tradition that I practice in, what they understand is, once you have, so the more and more you have access to that unified field, and then as you shift your identity to it, so that basically your basis of operation stays there. Once you stay there, then
Mm,
then you can become super creative about what it is that you're wanting to manifest, because then you're actively dreaming. Like, if you can recognize that you're the fundamental space and openness of reality, and that from that openness, which is nothing, that you're then dreaming something into existence, and that dreaming then kind of
mm,
permeates into the energetic level, and then to the extent that it is charged by your love and your compassion, because that's what creates this field of resonance. the world the world starts to dance. Yeah, it's creative, and I mean that's so much about why we're here, right? Is we're here as human beings to create, right? I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's beings where yeah, so much of the spiritual path is really about learning how to be creative.
Mm. Yeah. What are you creating right now?
What am I creating? That's a great question. Well, I'm one of the things I'm creating is a 4-year curriculum for my students. So that's
Mm.
been in process for a while. Um, Also, we have we're in the process of developing. It's kind of early stages now, but like a practice village in Costa Rica, so that
Ooh.
we can kind of when the kids get old enough, Nicole and I can go and just practice in real, real depth environment. My real interest is building educational systems. So, I mean, part of the Karuna Mandala and the curriculum for that is then building the kind of long term infrastructure that really allows people like ourselves to go on a lifelong journey. Because if you understand that there's a path to walk, and if you can build the infrastructure that allows people to do that, and that people don't have to keep searching, it's like you don't have to keep searching. Once you understand what the technologies are, what the curriculum is, then it's more like a process of learning, right? Rather than searching.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my that's what I'm creating right now is a school.
Oh, very cool. I love that. That was always like my backup plan, which it starts to come more and more to the forefront of why does it have to be my backup plan? But it was that, like, if everything in my life shit hit the fan, I was just gonna get rid of everything and go become a monk, and study Buddhism.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to in the world. So you don't have to give it up. We need to bring Hogwarts here.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
please. And
yeah.
so, you're creating that now. What spoke to you about Costa Rica?
Oh, I've been visiting there for like the last 8 years, and I just
Mm.
it's a place that our family's just yeah we it's the field there is really clean, right?
Mm.
It's beautiful. Um, yeah, and it's where spirit reveal showed me like, hey, this is where you have connections. This is where you have um, friends.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm hoping to build something in Costa Rica, and I'd also like to build something in Europe as well. Because essentially, what I'm interested in doing is building practice villages, right? Because we really need to have we need to build environments within which the new culture can be worked out. And to do that, you need to be
Mm.
around people and need to be engaged in practices. Um, we had my wife and I, we had a center in Boston for 15 years, a practice center. And it's very
Oh,
different.
wow.
It's very different if you're working with people day in, day out, and you see people every day. It's a very different kind of it's a very different kind of growth possibility than if it's just a weekend workshop or if it's just a retreat, right? There's something about
Absolutely.
being being around one another, no, day in, day out, and then whether that's meditation practice, whether that's circling, whether that's plant medicine work, um, I mean, all of these were all technologies that were part of the village, right? Like, it's like
Mm.
if you take the village away and it's just individuals going on their own journeys, um, I'm not so interested in that. For me,
Yeah.
what's more interesting is groups and the group soul, right? And
Mm.
and to do that, of course, actually, you need a really high level of individuation, right? You need to be a true individual, and actually, in order to function as part of a group soul, right?
Hmm.
That part of the journey of individuation is just a step along the way. Yeah, so that's the kind of that's the next 15 years.
Mm. Yeah, and I love that authenticity plays such a beautiful role in the growth of society, individual authenticity, even. That the more that we own ourselves and who we truly are, it's a benefit to all of society and those around us. And it empowers
Mm,
others to deeply be their own authentic selves as well. And then you begin to look around and everyone's surrendering to who they are. And once you're surrendered to who you are, it's easier to surrender into the unified field because there's less
mm.
barriers to entry. There's less things that seem scary in that surrender. Um,
Yeah, we
yeah.
yeah we all need each other for that.
Hmm. We
Yeah.
do. And so you developed Planetary Dharma? Is that am I correct in that understanding?
Well, that's a good question. Yes and no. My own journey had a pretty significant kind of awakening when I was around 17. Um,
Hmm.
and
What was
and
that
one
like?
um, that was interesting. Um, yeah, it was like well, I've already said that I was very interested in these sorts of studies, and then I was like sitting on my bed one day, like reading some text, and it was if I was sitting on a bed reading that text in 100 other places in 100 other times, and then like the whole
Mm.
non-dual ground of being just opened up. Um,
Oof.
So that and then about a few weeks after that, then it began to impact my heart. And my poor mother, because at the time I was like, I went through a time of just bawling my eyes out because of all the animals that were suffering. So, and
Mm.
just the level of sensitivity was excruciating. Um, really
Mm.
just that kind of really broke open my heart. Um, and then the third phase of that awakening process was more cognitive. It was uh, like getting blueprints, if you will, or downloads of a planetary of how to um, rebuild or how to kind of externalize a tradition that's been here for a long time but hadn't really reestablished itself back on the physical plane for since Atlantis. So I
Ooh.
mean, and it wasn't even that I necessarily believed in these kinds of things. It was just like, well, that's what came in. Um, and so I feel
How
like,
do you not believe now?
yeah, well, then you just act, like that's not mine to believe or not believe. If that's what manifests, then you just kind of act as if that's what you're doing because you know.
Yep.
Um,
This is your
and
reality.
Yes, for reality. That's right. Um, and so anyway, like I mean, I think that obviously I'm not the only one who's part of that. I think that we all obviously carry certain gifts, um, and in that sense, I think I've architected these kinds of things before. So oh look, who's that?
Yeah. I have a
Yeah.
dog as
So
well.
yeah,
This is Apollo's
yeah,
guest
yeah.
appearance.
Guest appearance. Yes. So, yeah, I'm kind of a what I'm calling planetary dharma right now is I think is a collective um, unfolding that's happening, and so in that sense, it's not just me. But in terms of
Mm.
articulating it and developing a path, I'm in the process of beginning to do that, and now finding teachers who I can also work with to do that.
Mm. Oof. Is that a challenge finding people?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we have, right, is that in order to actually to do what it is that we need to do, we have to have organization. Like
Hmm.
there's a lot of really there's quite a few really good teachers out there, but the predicament of the postmodern teacher is that he or she is teaching by themselves, and then because of that,
Mm.
they're at the mercy of the market, which is, and they don't have the support of a tradition. And the problem with that, of course, is if you're at the mercy of the market, you're always just generating what it is that kind of people need on the surface, which isn't the same thing as
Yes.
actually being able to actually build something, right? Now, to build something like the spiritual version of putting somebody on the moon, to do that
Hmm.
involves bringing different people together with different core skills, both in terms of like organization and also in terms of various teachings that fit together. Um, and of course, what makes it super difficult is that generally the field has a kind of postmodern, anti-hierarchical, no one's going to tell me what to do feel to it. Which, of course, when you have that, you can't build anything because everybody
Hmm.
wants to decentralize everything, which is fine. But actually, if you don't understand that beyond decentralization is holarchy, right? The necessity to actually build structures that are kind of hierarchically structured, because that's how reality is hierarchically structured. I mean, that's really the challenge that we have, is that
Hmm.
we have to get over our postmodern sense of wanting to everybody to be at the same level to get to a place of, well, okay, how do we build something which is going to last for generations, right?
Mm.
Because these
Yeah.
traditions are sciences, right? I mean, for instance, the shaman, your mentor that you mentioned, right? Like
Hmm.
how does that fit into the meditative pieces? How do we integrate those pieces, right? Um,
Yeah. You're reading my mind right now.
all that kind of work is it's very important, and it has to be done with like a super high level of integrity.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's a certain level of meditations that can be provided by um, everyone working together, and the people who know the most about bringing that knowledge into this reality with when we're not in the medicine, um, adding to the plant medicine work that someone who knows the plant medicine work deeper than almost anyone else in existence. It's um, kind of a cohesive group that way if everyone's willing to work together, and then we generate better humans. We generate people ascending to their spirit level.
Well, that's how you build schools, right? It's really like
Hmm.
building schools for adults. And then to do that,
Yeah.
you have to work out, well, what are the grades, right? We have no problem working that out from like K to 12. And
Hmm.
what needs to be learned? What are the metacognitive pieces? What's the emotional work that needs to be done? What's the what's the relational piece that needs to be done at each of these stages? I mean, I think that
Hmm.
that's really exciting about the time that we're in, is that these various fields are beginning to touch one another. You know, um,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely, and that's really what has drawn me to you. And the more I've gotten to the little I've gotten to know about you, it just and the work that you do is really. I was like, I don't know everything that Dr. John offers, but it's like you offer this thread to tie together what I've been learning in plant medicine and the mysticism, and tying it together with what I thought previously was my everyday reality that you're showing me is my own self-limiting belief. So it's just there. I'm like, oh, he already did the thread with the knot. He already tied the two things together. Like, it's great. But I was just one workshop. What are we going to do in a whole year? And so what are you offering? How can my listeners work with you if they desire to? Or
Well, so next year, starting in January, that's a year long, first year of a 4 year long training. Um,
Mhm.
and we could talk a little bit about that. I think I might offer a few weekends during the year, just because otherwise I'll be too insular. So there will be opportunity to do kind of open retreats.
Cool.
And I do work one on one with people, um, but we'll see, because part of a lot of my time will be taken up working with the people on the program, right?
Hmm.
Um, but next year, the focus of next year really is kind of like, in some ways, is traditional mysticism. Um,
Mm.
what I mean by that is uh, you know. Much of traditional mysticism has to do with like the process of kind of unity, of
Mm.
of experiencing, kind of being at one with whatever the thou is, right? And in that
Mm.
sense, people often talk about that as being in terms of concentration practice. Like, if you're going to concentrate on love, right? So a lot of what we're going to be doing next year is going to be working with the heart, and working with, essentially, kind of deepening of layers into love. So kind of
Hmm.
traditional love mysticism. Um, so that involves like developing certain psychological capacities for like sustaining attention, sustaining interest, sustaining peak
Mm.
performance. Um,
Hmm.
and like learning to develop positive states, learning to develop kind of ecstatic states
Mm.
of bliss, all of that in service of then being able to really rest the mind, and just have the mind just kind of rest into like its intimacy with reality. So that's a very like
Mm.
traditional kind of curriculum, right? Of like a Christian mystic, or a Jewish mystic, or a Sufi mystic, or Hindu mystic would recognize that kind of process. It's kind of common
Hmm.
all the schools, including Buddhism. And then the second year, we work on some practices which are more Buddhist, which are really about then opening up that unity to a sense of um, kind of complete openness and interpenetration with everything. Um,
Mm.
yeah, so we are going to be focusing really on developing. It's like the spiritual maturity of the self,
Mm.
not transcending the self, but like of the self, right? Like the self, because the self needs to develop character, the self needs to develop stamina, the self needs to develop enthusiasm, the self needs to develop attention, right?
Hmm.
Because there's also parts of you and me that aren't that, right? There's a
Sure.
part of you, right? But this has got to do with like what does the self need to learn, so that the self can then like connect into the unified field in a stable way.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Like that. That was something I identified earlier as I was feeling low energy today, and one of my best friends was like, "What do you need to feel more connected today?" And I was like, I need to get back in touch with my sense of play, and I need
Mm,
to get in touch with a little more of my tantric energy. And like, I
mm,
think I'm going to do that through dance. And when those two things for me specifically combine, then it's like magic starts happening left and right.
mm.
It's like, um, what's your secret?
Well, those are your disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that, like, you know that you should dance. You know that you should, I mean, I do too. I know
Yeah.
I should dance. I know I should play, right? But they're right. But the real practice is, do I have the ability to remember that that's what I need to do?
Right.
So that's kind of like so next year the focus is going to be on, it's like that kind of level of practice of like of how do we master setting goals. So it's interesting because people don't think of
Mm.
goal setting and goal attainment necessarily as part of the spiritual journey. But actually, at one level of
Mm-hmm.
mind, where you're first beginning, where you're really learning, well, how does the mind work? That actually there is a part of us that's really about, you have to master how to do that. Like, this is the goal.
Mm.
This is how you get there. Do it. This is the goal. This is how you
Yes.
get there. Do it. This is the goal.
Yeah.
Right? This is how you get there. Do it. Now that
Mm-hmm.
that lesson, as you learn that lesson, as you get more confidence in that, it doesn't just apply to meditation. It applies to the other parts of your life. Like, oh, this is how you get there. Then do it. Right. So that um, when you put yourself in a process where you can study and see, and this is what I find fascinating, where you can see that your mind is changing by engaging that, right? That
Mm.
you do something, you practice, something changes in the mind, and you do it again, and it changes again. That gives
Mm-hmm.
us like more and more confidence to do that with more and more parts of our lives, right? That we can become
Yes.
self-authoring.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's something I used to sort of figure out my own happiness was I started just taking every tool I could get and trying it to see what stuck and what worked. And um, by I became like addicted to trying new things because I knew after 10 of them, for instance, I knew that each new thing I learned was going to have an impact, whether it was the thing or just something that was helpful or another tool to have in my toolkit. Like I became addicted to that growth and to that self exploration. And in the beginning, it was hard and it sucked. And it's like you're feeling depressed and you don't want to change your thought process because we love to live in those thoughts that we know, in those energy patterns that we're familiar with. And,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
and it's sort of like that goal setting and attainment where it was like, okay, no, wait, no, now I know I have to change the thought process. I have to get up and I have to dance. I have to do the thing that's going to immediately change it instead of wallowing in it for days. And
that's right. And of
yeah.
course, the paradox is one part of the spiritual journey is like learning how to become and learning how to
Mm.
set goals and master them. And then another part of the journey is learning to have no goals, and that everything is perfect exactly as it is right now, right?
Yeah.
And how those two dynamics relate to one another, that's what
Mm.
that's where real mastery is, right? It's like, because
Yeah.
on the other hand, if we're not happy and content with where we are, we're never going to be happy and content because we're conditioning
Mm-hmm.
ourselves for more discontent. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I always find that balance. Um, that's such an art.
Yeah. Well, and what a dance of the masculine and the feminine, right? The masculine to set the goals and the feminine to do the surrender and like
Hmm,
um
hmm.
to, to watch that just continuously peak and valley and um hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I am so looking forward to working with you next year and all the things. How can my listeners keep up with you? Are you on social media? Not really. You're kind of on social
I'm
media.
in my cave, deep in the Himalayas. Luckily, I have a teenage daughter now who is like rolls her eyes at my lack of social media expertise. Um, I am on social media. I'm on Instagram. Well, my
Okay.
teenage daughter is on Instagram for me.
Okay.
Kurunamandala.org is the website, and you can find me on Instagram at Planetary Dharma. Um, yeah, and also my other website
Great.
is Samadhi Integral. That's more my private consulting website.
Okay. Well, I will have those all linked up in the show notes. And I only give you shit about not being on social media because I think I was like your 30th follower. right after you got one for the Aubrey Marcus podcast airing.
Hmm.
And I watched you
Yeah,
like
yeah.
snowball, and it's like, oh, this guy
And that
doesn't
was
actually know how to use this.
that was one of my manifestations. I peeked my head out of the cave, and then boom, and it's like, oh, that works.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been such a pleasure, and I can't wait to get to know you more and all the things that we'll do over the next 4 years, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you, Barrett. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and review this podcast wherever you're listening. I'm so grateful to have you on this journey with me. Until next time.